Elite Facts presents
8 of the cheesiest villains in films. 8. Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin in Spider-Man 2002. Say what you want about the early 2000s Spider-Man films, they were campy, they were ridiculous, but they were fun. Yes, we're even including Spider-Man 3 with its ridiculous dance sequence. It's so stupid that it brings a smile to your face. That being said, though, the first Spider-Man was pretty groundbreaking, as it was one of the first films, along with the first X-Men film, to resurrect the superhero genre that was senselessly beaten to the ground by the 1990s, with films like Steel, Spawn, and Batman and Robin. We'll get to that one soon. That being said, this film had a ton of campy moments in it. One moment in particular involved professional wrestler Randy Savage and Bruce Campbell from the Evil Dead films. However, nothing could ever match up to the ridiculousness of Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin. For anyone who thinks Dafoe couldn't play the role of the Joker well, just look at his performance as Green Goblin. He is just absolutely insane. One of the best scenes is when both the Goblin and Spider-Man are just casually hanging out on a rooftop after an intense fight. Dafoe just looked so chill in this scene that it's almost hilarious. We need more Willem Dafoe in superhero movies. Just saying.
7.
Paul Giamatti as the Rhino in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, 2014. Okay, we know it's not fair to have 2 Spider-Man films in a row. However, there's just so many cheesy villains from the franchise that we couldn't help but include another one. And it's our last Spider-Man mention, we promise. Now, with the Amazing Spider-Man series, there were so many villains involved in only 2 films. We could easily go with Rhys Ifans' portrayal of Dr. Curt Connors, aka the Lizard, or even Jamie Foxx and Dane DeHaan as Electro and the Green Goblin, respectively. However, we believe Paul Giamatti's portrayal as the Rhino is well deserving of a mention on this list. Pretty much a surefire thing to being a successful campy villain is to have the most over-the-top accent in existence, and Paul Giamatti nails it by doing the most over-the-top Russian accent you could possibly imagine.
6.
Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Final Nightmare. Okay, we're not talking about Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street 1, 2, 3, or Wes Craven's New Nightmare, because Freddy in those films was actually a wicked villain. We're talking instead about the Freddy who's literally a comedy act from the 4th film onward. Now, in the 3rd Nightmare on Elm Street, which many people cite as the best one, Freddy started showcasing more comedic elements in his persona. In the 3rd film, there was a really good balance between horror and comedy. However, after seeing how successful the 3rd film was, it was almost as if the producers attributed the success of the film to the change in Freddy's personality. Because of this, when the 4th, 5th, and final films in the franchise were released, Freddy was turned into a complete comedy act, doing things like force-feeding a person to death in a chef outfit, running someone over in a bus driver costume, and even acting like the Wicked Witch of the West. Now, don't get us wrong, some of these things are pretty funny, but Freddy was supposed to be a menace, not a comedian.
5.
Mr. Freeze from Batman and Robin, 1997. Oh boy, this film. What hasn't already been said about the disaster that was Batman and Robin? This film is seriously awful in every aspect. Well, except for one thing. Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze is just as ridiculous as you'd expect. So, in the early 1990s, there was a Batman the Animated Series episode that essentially rewrote the Mr. Freeze character from being a campy villain from the 1940s to a tragic villain story about how Mr. Freeze is actually a victim. He was originally a cryogenic scientist for Goth Corp, where he embezzled money from the company in order to continue his research into finding a cure for his wife's terminal illness. After being caught by the company's CEO, he's thrown against several beakers of chemicals, causing him to turn into Mr. Freeze. So he's not really your run-of-the-mill villain. He's just trying to find a cure for his wife. Of course, he does take the anger out on the city of Gotham, but he's still a victim no matter how you look at the situation. In the movie Batman and Robin, they follow this backstory pretty well. Well, until they throw in a ton of one-liners, jokes, and gags that just make Mr. Freeze a comedy act. Oh, and again, he's played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it just doesn't get any cheesier than Arnold spitting out ice puns every 5 seconds.
4,
Dolph Lundgren as Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. We've all quoted him at some point, don't lie. You can't tell us you've never said, "I must break you," or "If he dies, he dies," to someone at some point. Ivan Drago is a relic. He's the epitome of 1980s villains. So after fighting Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, for some strange reason, in Rocky III, it made you wonder what the next step in the Rocky franchise would be. Well, Rocky IV was made back in 1985 when communism was still strong in Russia. So why not have a roided-out Soviet-Russian boxer take on Rocky this time around? So Ivan Drago enters the ring. For the most part, though, Dolph Lundgren plays the role really well. He's intimidating throughout the whole film and is actually a convincing boxer, so you can't blame Lundgren for his performance. Hell, the character is actually not too bad, but when he says those 2 infamous lines, the cheese factor goes straight through the roof.
3,
Max Zorin from 007: A View to a Kill. So the James Bond franchise is no stranger to campy villains. In a series that gave us Blofeld, Hugo Drax, and Oddjob, you're probably thinking, who could possibly top all the classic Bond villains? Well, look no further than Max Zorin from A View to a Kill. Now, what makes him so darn strange? He's played by Christopher Walken. Yep, he's played by the strangest man in Hollywood and gives us quite the awkward but lovable performance. Max Zorin is an industrialist, the product of a Nazi genetic experiment, planning to destroy the Silicon Valley in order to gain a monopoly in the microchip market. So, pretty standard James Bond plot. Now, can you imagine giving an actor like Christopher Walken a role that is as crazy as Zorin is? I mean, all you have to do is watch the scene where Zorin guns down all of his employees in the underground caves, or when he fights Bond atop the Golden Gate Bridge. It's madness, to say the least.
2,
Colin Farrell as Bullseye in Daredevil, 2003. So, Daredevil was a thing. Remember the Daredevil film? Unfortunately, we do. This film was just plain awful. Like, there's no words to describe it, as there wasn't one shining moment in this film. Except for Bullseye. Bullseye is one of those villains that, yet again, overly plays up the accent in his performance. Bullseye is a goon hired by the Kingpin, played by Michael Clarke Duncan, to kill Daredevil. You can tell Colin Farrell didn't care about his performance in this film, so much so that he absolutely chewed the scenery in every frame he appears in. I mean, there's one scene where he shoots someone only to follow it up by saying "bullseye" while pointing at the markings on his forehead. It's ridiculous, and damn it, it's just way too funny not to mention his role as Bullseye on this list.
1,
Dr. Kaufman in Tomorrow Never Dies. Okay, now we know he's only a henchman, but come on, he was more or less the highlight in what was otherwise an average Bond movie. Tomorrow Never Dies isn't a bad film. In fact, it's a very enjoyable Bond film. However, it is admittedly a massive step down from the previously released GoldenEye. It had a decent plot, decent storyline, a fantastic actor playing James Bond in Pierce Brosnan, and possibly one of the greatest henchmen that simply doesn't get enough recognition. Dr. Kaufman is a hired assassin sent to kill Bond, and he's tasked with making this assassination look like a suicide. Sounds pretty standard, right? Well, Dr. Kaufman's personality is something we've never seen in a Bond film before. Sure, we've had the overly sophisticated villains like Blofeld, the foreign villains like Goldfinger, even though the character is supposed to be British, and we've had the most downright strange villains like the previously mentioned Max Zorin. Dr. Kaufman is all of these things rolled up into one character. Kaufman is presented with the most over-the-top German accent you could possibly imagine, and is shown to be well sophisticated in his line of work. He's only on screen for about 5 minutes, and yet he is the most memorable part of this film. Honestly, if you haven't seen his performance, check it out and enjoy the cheesiness for what it is.
Thanks for watching another amazing video, folks. Subscribe for more from Elite Facts.